Calvin, welcome back, man.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. I got to say, it's not as likely for me to get people on for part two as quickly as we were able to come together today, and I'm really happy about it. Usually I'll throw out the loose like, oh, let's get a part two or let's continue the conversation another time, and it's very difficult to do that sometimes with guests. But I'm happy we were able to kind of circle back and honestly just kind of talk about the second half of this conversation that I had every intention of getting to the first time, but we kind of got carried away and had a lot of good things to talk about that part one. So for those of you who are listening to this right now and have not listened to the first part of our conversation, I highly recommend going back and listening to that because it really sets the scene for everything that we're continuing the conversation on today. And I think having a solid foundation of a lot of the stuff that we talked about previously will make everything else that we talk about today click a little bit more, even though the things we might talk about today might be a little bit more well known to the general public, things like GLP-1 medications and supplements and low carb diets or keto diets, being in ketosis, insulin resistance, the role of insulin, maybe some environmental stuff, like things that again you'll be able to pick up on very quickly. But that last episode, if you can grind through it, I think it will make this part of this discussion, a little bit easier to comprehend as well. So before we dive into anything, give me some updates on the short few weeks that we've been apart. But anything new on your end that you want to kind of talk about, or you want to roll?
I mean, honestly, not much. I think things are going well. So, um, as we talked about a little bit off air, I did close on a second property. So, kind of trying to get or a little bit more in real estate, or at least owning property and making that money work for me. And then not really just bought bought my dream car. That was another thing that we talked about. So that was like that's kind of consumed me for a little bit just because like how excited I've been. But other than that, kind of just trying to keep the ball rolling on everything. I did wear the same shirt as last time just because I figured it'd be fitting.
Continuity, man. That's what it's all about. And yeah, the car in the house situation, there's not many 19-year-olds that can say what you just said in that sentence. So congratulations. I think that's really awesome. And uh, it's funny to see, yeah, I'll get a new car, but maybe I'll get a rental property to maybe support some of the other things I want to buy in the future. So kudos to you, man. You're in a different light here than where I was and where I know most people are at 19 or in their teenage years before they hit 20. So did the car situation and the house, was that something that you've been working hard to pull the trigger on, or was it just like right place, right time, try to take advantage of the opportunities as they present themselves, or was that something that you'd kind of been keeping on your radar?
Yeah, so the car was on my radar for a while. When I bought the car, I had previous to that when I was closing on my first property. And the way that I manage my money, I have certain amounts of money in accounts that I can't touch. So with the amount of money that I had for the down payment and left over for a car, the car I currently have wasn't in the budget. And then obviously once that money became free, moved money around, that car became in the budget again. So I sold the other car and bought this one. I got lucky because when I went to the dealership, they had the exact one I want with like the coolest uh, paint job I've ever seen. So like not only was it the car that I was looking for, but it also like looked amazing. I didn't have to pretty much do anything to it. So when they brought it out, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do that one. And then bought it the next day. And then the property was something that I had in mind when I bought the first one. I was thinking about buying two at the same time, but age the lenders didn't want to give two successive mortgage loans. Um, so I ended up buying the first one and then had to kind of shop around for different lenders for 3 or 4 months to see if I could trick someone to give me another loan.
Nice, dude. Yeah, I feel like when you know what car you want, you go into a lot and you see it and your expectations are exceeded, man, it's an easy sell for those car salesmen. So I bet they were drooling to see Calvin come to the lot that day. But congrats, dude. That's fun. Is cars just one of your things? We all have our things we like spending money and time on and are really interested in. Is cars one of those for you, or do you have other interests out there?
It wasn't until about 2 years ago, and then I drove around in a Corvette one time, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna buy one day. And then that one day kind of it came a lot quicker than I expected. I was expecting it to be like a retirement car, um, and then kind of the past 2 years have really things have just taken off. So I was in the position for it, and I'm like, I'm gonna do it just to make that 17-year-old Calvin a little bit happier.
Nice,
Um,
dude.
yeah, but I do like cars. I'm learning. I'm becoming more fanatical about cars. Like I'm becoming liking them more and talking to more people who own nice cars and know a lot more than I do about cars. So it's becoming an interest and a hobby of mine.
Nice, dude. Yeah. Yeah. Especially when you're exposed to some of the vehicles and, the power and the just, yeah, how sleek some of these things look. It's like, yeah, it's pretty easy to spend your money on that when you got 5 jobs and, you don't really have kids yet or anything like that. So a little bit easier to justify. But man, I don't know. I think that's a good point to make and something that I feel very similarly about. Maybe my thing isn't necessarily cars per se, but it is golfing, or it is spending money on good food or going to restaurants, right? And maybe we don't eat out a ton, but when we do go out to eat, it's to our favorite spots. And, I'm not getting the $15 plate. I'm going to get the $35 plate if I want to go out to eat. And I forget what financial guru. There's so many out there. Just like there's a lot of voices in the nutrition space, bro. Like the finance space is even scarier. But there's a philosophy out there where it's like, hey, be really frugal and save on the things that maybe you don't give a fuck about as much. But when it comes time to afford or pay for things that you really do care about, like ball out, like that's okay. And I've found that type of philosophy really works for me. I almost see it working kind of in your world right now too. But I really have found that to be extra true in like health and fitness to a certain extent of like, hey, pick and choose like what's most important to you. Like you go to a function and you're not a big sweets guy, but you love chicken wings or whatever it is, or maybe that's a reason. It's like, hey, maybe I'll drink tonight, but maybe I'm not going to eat the appetizers or the desserts, right? And maybe I'll get a salad. And for somebody that might be, you know what, me spending my calories for the day, I'm going to spend it on the things that are most important to me around all the other stuff that I do each week and throughout the day. But I find spending money on other things is very applicable to that. So I just find that fascinating. I don't know if you resonate with that at all, but that's definitely something that I've subscribed to a little bit more over the last 4 or 5 years of my life since owning my own business and especially now, we had a kid recently. So just like thinking about how I want to allocate my money and funds and stuff, like it's definitely changed now, right? I don't have that same luxury of being, just like a bachelor or just being in a loving marriage without any other responsibilities. But I still think that's really important for the soul. And man, that's stuff that I think people don't do very well sometimes that, maybe their quality of life could improve if they adopt some of these mindsets. So
Yeah, I think there's a kind of an all or nothing mentality. A lot of times, is like people are
yeah,
just almost oblivious with their money. They'll spend it on whatever they want, whenever they want, and then they find themselves in kind of in a hole. And other people will never spend anything on anything. And I think for me, I'm trying to find that middle ground. Is I am trying to make financially or like I guess long term responsible purchases. So property is that kind of responsible purchase for me. And obviously, like I don't really spend much money on anything other than property and cars. I eat 3 times a day, but other than that, and gas is expensive now. But other than that, like I'm not spending a bunch of money on anything. Yeah, I saw that sigh. Gas is horrible. Um, but yeah, so, I'm not blowing my money every day. But there are certain things that I will buy, and it kind of, um, I'll say it makes the hard work that I'm doing on the back end makes it feel a little bit more worth it. Like there's something to look forward to every day. I get to go outside, start up the car. It sounds pretty nice when it starts up, and then drive around. Especially when people want to drive with me. There's things to look forward to because I made that one purchase that might not on paper be the most responsible, but you know definitely has felt worth it to me.
nice, dude. Nice. I love that. Well, good for you, bro. It's fun. Yeah. At the end of your outro, this last podcast, you mentioned your private account. I think I followed you after that, but it's also just, it's fun to kind of see what you got going on in the personal life as much as, what you've been talking about in the nutrition world. So, speaking of nutrition stuff, I want to take a little hard pivot here and talk about something that I wanted to ask about last time, but we didn't necessarily have time for. And it's a continuation of part of this GLP-1 kind of conversation medication that we briefly touched on last time, but we didn't, I think, talk about some of the other things that people could purchase or buy in the space that are being advertised to people today. And we talked about a lot of the gut hormones. We stuck a little bit more with the GLP-1 and the GIP, just because those are a little bit more common knowledge today. And I think a lot of these weight loss and diabetes medications has brought that to a lot of people's attention, which is phenomenal. I think more people know about these things. They might not know what they do, but they know about them and they're advertised and you see the commercials and their friends might be on them. So it's like, it's definitely all the rage and people know about them. As with any trend in the health space, when you see something like this happen, you see something like a weight loss drug or, a diabetes management drug come out that's so effective as some of the ones that we're seeing on the market here today, you are bound to see grifters or companies or people or even celebrities. I'm thinking about Khloe Kardashian here and people trying to monetize other avenues centered around, some of the products or some of the pharmaceutical interventions that you see on the market today. And more specifically, what I'm talking about is these like oral forms of GLP-1 supplements or medications, or it's been taken to the extreme where people are like creating recipes like oat Zempic, where it's like, yeah, put oats in your smoothie and you're going to get the same benefits of a GLP-1 medication injecting, twice a week kind of thing. I'm sure you've seen this in the space because it's flooded my feed over the last 2, 3, 4 years now. But I want to speak as to why maybe those are not the same, why they aren't the same as the pharmaceutical grade kind of like, interventions that you might get from an actual doctor, someone prescribing you those medications versus someone going over the counter, going to hims or hers.com, or getting their, Khloe Kardashian type of like supplement line, Ozempic or whatever they have selling out there. I'm not even sure what products are out there, but I see them a lot and I've hear people talking about them and people might gravitate towards that even before going to the pharmaceutical route. This is a long intro, but what are some issues with that? And if we can maybe speak to the big differences potentially between the stuff you might get from a prescribed physician who's trained in prescribing doses and, starting these medications versus people who are just maybe out here advertising and using the words that people are familiar with to trying to get into their pocketbooks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so effectively nowadays we're seeing a lot of GLP-1 boosting supplements and then GLP-1 boosting meals. So people will effectively, kind of what you mentioned, the Ozempic idea. It's effectively a morning bowl of oats with specific ingredients that are touted to boost your GLP-1. And I'm not saying that they don't, but the idea is that people are coming online or in advertisements saying that they are just like, if not better than things like Ozempic and Wegovy. So we have to think of what Ozempic and Wegovy are. These are medications that are effectively the active ingredient in the medication, which is semaglutide, binds to the GLP-1 receptor and activates it. So we can think we're effectively injecting a medicine that acts just like the GLP-1 that we naturally produce. The thing with these medications is that one, we take them fairly frequently. So they're typically taken on a daily basis. And two, when they are taken, their half-life is far longer than anything we'll ever get from food or any supplement. What I mean by that is one, the magnitude of GLP-1 effect that we get from these medications is above, again, anything we'll see from a supplement or medication. And two, the duration of time that that medication is actively suppressing our appetite is up to days. So we see that after we take a supplement or after we consume a meal, we might see a rise in GLP-1 for minutes to hours. But that GLP-1 very quickly and rapidly comes back down to normal after that supplement or after that meal has been fully digested. The thing with these medications is that we're bypassing the gastrointestinal tract and going directly into the bloodstream. And the speed at which these medications get broken down is far slower than the speed at which our natural GLP-1 gets broken down. So we see that these medications will be suppressing our appetite for, again, up to 24 to 48 hours. Whereas after you take that supplement, you might get 1 to 2 hours of benefit, and then you'd have to retake another supplement. Again, the other thing is the magnitude of effect that these medications have. We think we have so many GLP-1 receptors in our body, and the amount of GLP-1 that our gastrointestinal tract can produce, regardless of whether we're taking 20 supplements at a time, isn't nearly as high as the magnitude of GLP-1 receptor stimulation we're getting from these medications. So we're just effectively we're thinking about different levels when it comes to this problem. I'm not saying that some of these supplements and some of these meals don't increase GLP-1 and decrease appetite and affect weight loss. That being said, they're not nearly as strong as these medications as the physician described prescribed medications. Um, that being said, they might come with a few less side effects because of the half-life. One thing that we get in trouble with when it comes to the medication is once you've taken it, you're not going to do anything to speed up the half life of that medication. So if you start feeling sick or nauseous, you're not going to be able to get that medication out of your system within the next 24, 48 hours. Whereas if you're taking a supplement, you might come back down to normal within an hour, hour and a half, and you effectively don't see the biggest or as big of side effects. So when we're thinking about the specific supplements, we're effectively just mimicking food molecules. So most supplements are going to be containing things like polyphenols. They're going to be containing things like dietary fiber, and some of them are going to be containing allulose. One other thing that we'll see that we don't really get from food is berberine. There's not much data on berberine and its effectiveness. There's a very tiny amount of data to indicate that it increases GLP-1 slightly, but the magnitude isn't very big, and it's effectively the same as what we can get from food. So it's not going to be doing anything magical. We really don't know of any oral supplements that are going to be radically increasing GLP-1 to the point where we're going to see meaningful weight loss. That being said, again, most of those supplements are mimicking food molecules. So a lot of those supplements we can get in a cheaper way from food. Again, fiber, polyphenols, we're looking at things like fruits and vegetables, beans and legumes. And then when we're looking at things like allulose, that's a non-nutritive sweetener that again would be effectively only in supplement form, but it's something that we can add on to our food to make it a little bit sweeter and also again increase GLP-1 a little bit. So it's just, I guess when we're talking about these things, the advertisement gets a little bit, uh, I don't want to say shady, but it definitely is misleading a lot. The idea that we can take a supplement and not have to inject ourselves with a very expensive medication and get the same results is, on paper, it sounds amazing, but in reality, it's just we're thinking about different ballparks here of appetite suppression and weight loss effectiveness.
Super well said, dude. Super well said. I'm happy you bring up the half-life piece of that. And not that people listening to this need to know what half-life necessarily is for everything, but it's very relevant and it's what explains, a lot of the efficacy of, whether you take a supplement or whether you take a pharmaceutical grade kind of intervention for your weight loss or your diabetes medications and whatnot. And the best way that I can maybe kind of describe it a little bit, which isn't super comparable, but people love caffeine out there, right? And imagine, right, we take the half-life of caffeine, meaning like you drink a cup of coffee, how long does it take for half of that amount of caffeine that you get from that coffee to leave your system? For caffeine, is somewhere between like 4 to 6 hours, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, plus or minus an hour, depending on the person. But you have a energy drink or a cup of coffee, and 4 to 6 hours later, half of the amount of caffeine that you had from that drink is still in your system, but half of it has left, right? Imagine, some of these medications, if we kind of relate it to these GLP-1 agonists, where it's like, hey, maybe you have a cup of coffee, but that's something that lasts you for days, right? Like we would not want that with caffeine, but with some of these other hormonal medications and, the interventions that we see for obesity and weight loss, like we want that. Like we want these hormones lingering around, but you cannot emulate that formula. You cannot give that to people orally, right? You cannot have that same half-life by taking some, proprietary blend of something that who knows what's even in it and expect to get the same results as someone taking an injectable, once a week or every other day or daily, whatever their, prescription is. So I'm happy we clarified that a little bit because I think once people can appreciate that and understand that, like, oh yeah, these things work very differently. And therefore maybe this thing that's being sold as like a kind of a separate, entity or avenue, like people can kind of differentiate, like, is this worth my money? Is this something that's going to give me a decent return on my investment? Or am I better off spending it on other things, right? Maybe like getting actual supplements that might be more bang for your buck, depending on the person, getting a vitamin D, getting creatine, getting fish oil, maybe getting a general multivitamin, spending the rest of your money on food. Like there's ways to individualize your supplement regimen to what your lifestyle looks like, but budgeting out for a GLP-1 type of, supplement or oral medication or oral supplement probably isn't the best bet for most people. And I feel pretty confident in saying that like most people listening to this can pass on those medications. It's just not doing as much or what you think it might be doing as much as it's being advertised. But again, they kind of take this GLP-1 or this kind of like weight loss medication wave and are trying to sell people on a different wave of that maybe, can benefit their pocket. So I think sometimes it's disingenuous, but again, you said it, misleading more than anything. And once we can kind of help people just become a little bit more of informed decision makers, it's like, if we can prevent you from spending your money on this shit, like to me, that's a victory for a lot of people, or at least understanding how these things work, why they might not be effective. And then, yeah, you can effectively move on from there. So thank you for clarifying that. I just wanted to start with that because I do think that was relevant to the last part of our conversation, but it's something that, isn't necessarily talked a ton about. And I think there's a lot of confusion is like, hey, what's the difference between this like $80 a month supplement thing where, some people are, having to spend $500+ a month, even with insurance on board to afford some of these other GLP-1 medications, which is a problem in itself as well. Like people who need this drug and medication can't even actually get it, which is kind of alarming. But yeah, it's just a classic example of what can happen in the health and fitness space and what is marketable and um, what companies and people are willing to do to maybe make some monetary gains on that. Amazing, dude. Amazing. Coming off of the GLP-1 medication stuff, I wanted to kind of pick up where we left off. We were talking a lot about hormones this our last conversation. And one thing we did not get to was insulin, which I would argue again is kind of top of mind or something that a lot of people know about. Like people know about insulin. Oh, my pancreas produces insulin, and insulin is responsible for blood sugar regulation, and insulin resistance is a real problem. And that gets taken to the extreme now where it's like people are thinking about trying to micromanage every single blood glucose response after a meal, right? Like it can be taken to that extreme. But blood sugar and insulin has gotten a lot of attention over the last, I don't know. I've been in this space for 6 years now, posting content. I've seen it really blow up within the last 3, 4, 5 years, especially with like glucose goddess and some of these other people who are kind of, talking about their shtick when it comes to um, just overall health and well-being. But how does insulin enter the chat when it comes to appetite regulation or dysregulation? And maybe we can take a step back and talk about maybe how and why insulin is produced and maybe how insulin resistance, might be a bad thing. But when it comes to appetite, what I really want to talk about is like, is it something that influences appetite? Is it something that's causing everybody to get hungry? And when your blood sugar is high and your insulin is high, and all of a sudden you have a crash, and that's what drives people to eat? Like, is there any truth to that? But take what you want with this question. But I want to revisit this because I do think it's something that I know a lot of people can nod their head in agreement with that, like, yeah, I know this is important, but how important and how does this factor into everything else that we've talked about so far?
Yeah, say to make things very simple, we know that insulin is considered an anorexigenic hormone. That really means is that when insulin levels in the bloodstream increase, our appetite will decrease. There's receptors inside of the brain that insulin can bind to suppress appetite. There's a lot of ideas on the internet that insulin itself is making you hungry. We have effectively no data to support that. In fact, again, all of the data that we currently have indicates that insulin itself is anorexigenic, so it suppresses appetite. And two, when we see higher insulin levels in the bloodstream after a meal, we typically see more suppressed appetite. And I say that after a meal because that becomes kind of important. So as we as you kind of alluded to, there's a phenomenon called insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is effectively when the insulin levels in our bloodstream are increased, but insulin's effects aren't actually coming to fruition the way that we would expect them to. So one of the biggest roles of insulin is when insulin increases, it will decrease blood glucose. We see that those with insulin resistance have high insulin levels, but also high blood glucose levels, indicating that insulin inside their bloodstream isn't functioning properly to suppress their blood glucose. And that's a state that we would consider insulin resistance. So, in the same phenomenon, we see that insulin resistance, so we know insulin has a anorexigenic or appetite suppressive function. So, in insulin resistance, we might see high insulin levels, but we don't see suppressed appetite. But the important part is how those insulin levels are fluctuating. In insulin resistance, we would see chronically high insulin levels. Those insulin levels are high 24/7. Whereas if we see high insulin levels after a meal, and then those insulin levels come back down to normal in the time period we would expect them to, those are insulin levels. That would be the insulin cascade of a non-insulin resistant human being. So an idea is that insulin resistance itself might have an appetite stimulating effect because that appetite suppressive effect of insulin isn't coming to fruition. But the idea that insulin itself is the problem and insulin's functioning is the problem is incorrect because we know that there's a lot of studies to indicate that meals that increase blood glucose the most and therefore increase blood insulin the most, especially at breakfast and at lunch, tend to have the most appetite suppressive effect compared to those that are low glycemic or have lower blood glucose curves. So the idea that again insulin is the problem is kind of just faulty. So the idea that suppressing insulin at all costs is the way to get skinny and get your perfect physique and feel better, again, is something that we don't have really any data to support.
Yeah, dude. Yeah. I love that. And I'm happy you mentioned all those things. Someone might be sitting here thinking like, fuck, that's the opposite of what I've been told or what I've been led to believe by maybe certain wellness accounts or people promoting maybe more of a low carb dieting lifestyle. You see, Dr. Gundry or Lustig out here just talking about how carbohydrates are the root of all evil. And, um, again, for the people who do not know, like the insulin model of obesity or the carbohydrate insulin model, it's something that's been kind of debunked, more times than we can actually count. But this whole idea that like, someone has a higher carbohydrate kind of diet or eat a lot of carbs with meals or eat any carbs for the matter of fact. Like people are out here going to the extent of like, oh, if you have grapes, like you're fucked, right? But you eat grapes, you have a blood sugar quote unquote spike or your blood sugar rises in response to your body eating that, carbohydrate. And then that's what causes an insulin spike. Insulin being, more of like a storage hormone where you'll hear people talk about lipolysis and like when your insulin is high, like lipolysis is blunted and you're not able to burn fat and therefore your body turns off this switch of fat burning and so you can't burn any fat or lose any weight when your insulin is high. So having this kind of like rhetoric around like we want to minimize or reduce insulin spikes and I don't even know if spikes is the right word here. I think that is very fear mongering in itself. Like we're talking about things that are normal within the body, like normal physiological responses within the body that our body is well equipped to handle. But people, I think, assume that, hey, when you have insulin resistance or the start of prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, it's like it's carbohydrates' fault, or that's the only thing at play here that is influencing whether or not you're insulin sensitive or not. When in reality, it's more of a total energy consumption type of issue, right? And it's the consumption and the lack of activity that people have and the lack of muscle that people are experiencing now. It's not just one factor of, oh, you have carbs, therefore you're going to be insulin resistant. And you're going to get type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's, right? Or whatever people are kind of extrapolating this information to. But time and time again, we see this be debunked when you equate calories or protein and you see people who have overweight, obesity, assuming we're matching calories, we're matching protein. It doesn't matter if you're low carb or if you're high carb. Like you can lose the same amount of weight as, somebody doing a different dieting protocol as long as the calories that we're consuming are sufficient for that person to be in a deficit and we can see some fat loss happen with that. I also find this funny. It's another nail in the coffin. When we talked about GLP-1 medications, right? Like part of the mechanism of action for them is to secrete more insulin as well. There's a multitude of functions, but if we see some of these best weight loss medications we've ever seen on the market, and the safest weight loss medications we've ever seen, and part of their mechanism is increasing insulin. It's just funny because a lot of these types of gurus, low carb gurus, that just tend to move the goalpost more and more. But a takeaway from this little monologue in your little, well said type of segment is like, carbs are not something that you should necessarily fear or trying to minimize insulin spikes or your rise in insulin. It's just not a good allocation of mental energy for a lot of people, in my opinion. Um, and when you actually understand and appreciate the fact that, yeah, insulin can be anorexigenic and, it's technically appetite, suppressing. And there's a lot of things when you maybe know the back science behind it, you can maybe prevent yourself from falling into these deep, dark holes that people never get out of sometimes. in terms of identifying with one type of diet or thinking that one type of diet is superior to the rest. That type of kind of like content or the things that people can kind of consume over time, I think could be very harmful and just miss the mark and lead people to a place that we can prevent by just actually appreciating the systems and everything else at play. It's just very rarely is there one mechanism, there's one pathway that, is the end all be all for these things. Like our body is the summation of so many hormones and so many interactions and so many different confounding variables that it's not just one thing. It's not one food group. It's not one mechanism of action. It's not one hormone like insulin that is going to be a predictor of whether or not you're going to be healthy over the long term. It's a combination of a lot of these things. And this overly reductionist mindset to me is just something that, again, misses the mark and is leaving people in places where they're worse off going down that path than actually, being a little bit more of an informed decision maker and preventing themselves from just burrowing themselves into these low carb dieting kind of camps, which again have some utility, but it just sometimes not for the reasons that people think, that's working.
Agreed.
Nice, dude. Nice. Yeah, I love that. I think, acknowledging the fact that insulin is at play here and that's another hormone, and when that isn't working well, like that does present and cause issues. But I don't want people sitting here thinking they can't eat fruit, or sitting here thinking, because ironically, a lot of these like starchy carbohydrates, and we talked about oats and we talk about fruit and we talk about vegetables, both starchy and non-starchy vegetables, like foods that have carbohydrates in them. Man, if people are out here thinking that they should avoid those because of the glucose, and they're missing out on the nutrients and the fiber and the satiety benefits and all the other wonderful things that fiber could give, that trade-off of you avoiding all sugar, all fruit, or all of these types of, nutrients comes at an expense, and ironically sometimes can make it more difficult for people, as well. Insert the carnivore crowd, but I just find that there's so many health benefits of having more fiber that not eating that is almost working against people in certain contexts. Assuming we're eating foods and fiber sources that you can tolerate and feel good with and that are medically appropriate for you. But yeah, I don't think completely eliminating these food groups is always people's best bet, and can usually lead to more disordered eating patterns than anything else.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially when it comes to insulin, I think on the internet it's espoused as like the root of all evil. So the idea that insulin also makes you really hungry is really easy to accept. So if again, if you're very deep into the low carb community, like, hey, we're trying to minimize all insulin fluctuations. Um, the second someone says, hey, insulin also makes you really hungry, you're just going to go ahead and believe it, because effectively this is like the worst hormone that the human body has ever produced. Um, and that's another thing to think about, is like the human bodies have adapted for so long to effectively produce the specific hormones that they need at the right times. And if it was a hormone that they produced that didn't serve them function, we wouldn't continue to produce it. And given that humans have produced insulin since the dawn of our existence, um, the idea that insulin is this horrible hormone that we're just effectively cursed with, is kind of just missing a lot of history and how evolution works. So insulin has a very important function in the body. So the idea that minimizing insulin at all costs is the best thing to do is kind of just, again, it's missing a broader picture. And then obviously, again, in those low carb communities, it's fairly easy to convince people of effectively anything you want, as long as it goes against the idea of eating carbohydrates. So you could tell them that everything is going to make them sick or unhealthy or overweight, things of the like. As long as it's against carbohydrates, it's very easy to push a message anti whatever, as long, even if it's not true, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. While we're on this, I want to give kind of a classic example that I feel like a lot of people can maybe identify with or have heard at one point. I'm curious what your response would be to it if someone comes up to you and says this, where it's like, hey, we really need to balance your blood sugars level throughout the day. And, if you have a super high carbohydrate meal in the morning and you have a blood sugar spike afterwards and you find yourself really hungry at 10 or 11 a.m., insert any meal here, right? Lunch or dinner, snacks. But let's say, you'll hear the classic example of like, oh, your blood sugar spikes and then your body produces all this insulin and it gets it back down to a normal levels, assuming we're talking about like generally healthy people or non-insulin resistant type of people here. And we can relate it to other populations as well who are showing signs of insulin resistance. But um, is that a blood sugar thing where people are like, oh, now I'm hungry 2 hours later again because my blood sugar's crashed and they aren't stable, and therefore that's the thing that's driving me to eat? Is there any truth to that, or where would we maybe poke holes in that or add context to try and paint a better picture as to maybe it's not just this one thing that we're thinking about, but maybe there is some relevance to this idea as well?
Yeah, I guess there's really not data to indicate that, in all humans, healthy humans specifically, that after we eat carbohydrates, we see a rise in blood glucose, and then it subsequently falls below normal levels. We have a multitude of different hormones that are their primary job is to raise blood glucose. So as soon as we see blood glucose levels dip below normal, we very rapidly get them back up to normal levels within minutes. We think that insulin is one of the only hormones, if not the only hormone that we have that lowers blood glucose. Whereas we have 5, 10, 15 other hormones that all are designed or all have the function of raising blood glucose. We think of glucagon, the glucocorticoids, things like that. So the idea that the human body always goes hypoglycemic after the consumption of a high carbohydrate meal, really, we have no data to support that idea. Um, there are, again, we see differences between healthy and unhealthy people. In individuals who effectively, the more unhealthy they get, the more insulin resistant they are also getting. We might see overcompensation of insulin production. And when we begin to see insulin production going higher than normal levels, trying to compensate for the insulin resistance, we might see worse blood glucose control, even on the lower ends. Effectively, we think the body is very attuned to um, maintaining blood glucose with specific amounts of insulin when insulin sensitivity is full or almost full. Um, but as we see worse and worse insulin sensitivity, we do see higher insulin productions, and we might see some difficulties with overproduction of insulin trying to pull blood glucose down lower than normal. Again, this really isn't a very long lasting hypoglycemic episode. It would be minutes, just because, again, all of those other hormones. But in those minutes, that would be the time where people go, oh, I'm very hungry. I'm going to go get another meal. Um, that being said, again, the data that we have on healthy individuals indicates that high or low carbohydrate diets don't have really any significant effect on appetite regulation. That is in the same caloric, micronutrient, and protein state. Some people prefer high or low carbohydrate, but there's no data to indicate that higher carbohydrate diets 100% make you more hungry. And there's really a lot of data actually is the opposite, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I'm just thinking about, a lot of times the people who might be saying this, uh, are the people who, are maybe stopping at Starbucks, for example, and you get a cappuccino and you get a scone and then you get the egg bites, because you want to get some protein, right? If you look at the totality of that meal, you might be getting 300+ calories from the scone or whatever pastry you get, or breakfast sandwich, insert whatever, right? Like you're not getting a ton of protein at a lot of these meals if you're stopping at Starbucks or a gas station or even just like making stuff at your place. But you have a drink that probably has some calories and some carbohydrate in the form of sugar in there. You get some other type of fat and carb dense type of pastry or treat or donut, whatever. And maybe you get some protein, maybe you don't, but it's like, man, if you could look at that meal, like no fucking shit, that meal doesn't take you very far. Like not not many people can sit here and argue that that would be the best way to start your morning every single morning, and that you're getting everything you need by constructing your breakfast some of these ways or stopping on the road and getting some of this stuff. And I find that it's not really about the blood sugar necessarily. Like maybe yes, that's relevant. We can talk about how that might fluctuate in response to some of these meals, but it's like no, look at your meals and look at your perpetual consumption around some of these things, or eating away from home, or maybe not getting enough protein in the morning. It's like, yeah, you have 600 calories, most of it coming from carbohydrate. It's like, man, that's just not lasting you very long. Like you might get another hour or two into your day and you're like, I'm fucking hungry again because there was no fiber, there was no protein. Maybe you got 10 grams of protein, but that's a far cry from 30, 40 grams that might be actually doing a better service for you in the morning. And same goes with lunch and dinner. Someone goes to Panda Express and they get the orange chicken and they get the rice and they get the noodles and they eat their fortune cookie at the end. It's like you can see why carbs are painted as the bad guy because they are present in a lot of these foods and a lot of these really tasty, hyperpalatable foods that we talked about on the last episode. But again, it's likely the combination of the fact that it's like really high calorie, really tasty, really easy to like eat past it being full, but actually it's not actually giving you the same satiation benefits as, if you were to have different types of breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or getting more whole nutrient dense foods, or getting more lean sources of protein, or, some of these more calorie friendly, higher protein, macro friendly options. It's like, I don't want people to overcomplicate it. When you look at your meal and you think your blood sugars are crashing in the mid afternoon, it's one, probably because you're not eating enough or you're fucking starving come mid afternoon. Or maybe you're not getting enough of the right nutrients that actually keep you full and satiated until the next meal or, dinner time. And people are snacking, and what people snack on around the office, like they reach for the popcorn or the, graham crackers or the Nature Valley bar, and they have that with their energy drink. It's like, I just want people to appreciate the fact that maybe it's more about the food composition than maybe how it is necessarily responding in your body. And it's just the lack of fiber, lack of nutrients, lack of things that food is actually giving you that is probably the biggest predictor of whether or not you're going to feel great or not soon after you have those meals or takeout
Mhm.
meals, whatever it is. So I just wanted to say that out loud because I see that a lot. And that's usually some form of like low hanging fruit that we might see with people where it's like, hey, we're not under consuming, we're not eating enough of these nutrients. And, you take that same Starbucks meal and you stop and you get the egg bites, but you also have, a protein shake or some type of protein source, or you get the yogurt parfait and you have 25, 30 grams of protein with some fruit and your coffee in the morning. Again, that's just going to look very different than you getting the croissant and the frappuccino and whatever kind of higher calorie drinks and food combinations you could get there. I don't know why I'm picking on Starbucks right now, but it's common and a lot of people stop for coffee in the morning. But usually those are kind of the things that maybe we could correct and again spend more of our time and attention into correcting or adding to your routine instead of just thinking like I'm fucked because my insulin is spiked and I have no control over that. It's like you do, but we just don't need to think about that.
I think one important factor to mention is that a lot of the things that do lower blood glucose are appetite suppressive. Fiber, protein, polyphenols, specific micronutrients, dietary fats themselves do have an appetite suppressive effect. So a lot of the things that we think about that can uh, reduce the absolute magnitude of blood glucose do have benefits in and of themselves. But their benefit isn't because they reduce blood glucose. They reduce blood glucose in addition to the benefits they have for appetite regulation. Again, a lot of these are because they go into the gastrointestinal tract and alter GLP-1 or other gastrointestinal hormone production. So a big thing for things like fiber and polyphenols is that they increase a multitude of different molecules inside the gastrointestinal tract, again, that signal to the brain to reduce appetite, or that have appetite suppressive effects on the brain. So a lot of the things that people say, hey, this reduces my blood glucose and it makes me less hungry. The reason isn't because it reduces your blood glucose. There's other factors for that, whatever that ever molecule is, that have appetite suppressive effects. One of their other effects happens to just be a lowering of blood glucose.
Yeah, dude. Awesome. And I feel like this is a good transition or segue into ketosis or low carb diets in general. Again, people say low carb and keto interchangeably, but they are very different. Like they are not necessarily the exact same thing. But in this kind of like social media landscape, like low carb dieting is, a dietary approach that a lot of people tend to gravitate towards or want to try, or they hear our conversation today and maybe they might think differently about it. But the general person who maybe doesn't have the science or background or education level to kind of differentiate like, hey, people out here saying low carb or keto and your body will go into ketosis and burn primarily fat as your fuel source, therefore you're going to lose more body fat. Like that's a very enticing, reason to try this dietary approach. And you can see why people might get more excited about that instead of saying, oh yeah, no, you could track your food and have more of a flexible dieting approach and include carbohydrate. It's like, no, that doesn't sound as sexy as something that I'm going to be literally burning and fat off of my body because, my body's in ketosis or whatnot. So there are these dieting protocols, especially from the low carb camps that are being promoted as the best way to eat or a way that is going to be more conducive to fat loss, which again, we can kind of again appreciate the fact that it's more about the total calories that is the reason why these diets work and why these types of dietary protocols are effective for people more so than the actual rules that you're abiding by. And I think a lot of people can kind of understand this idea that fat burning or substrate utilization is very different than actual body fat, like net body fat loss. Like just because you're burning more fat as fuel because you're eating more fat does not necessarily equate to the fact that you are losing body weight in conjunction with that. And ironically, a lot of times people might go on keto and sometimes they can gain weight because they're eating very calorically dense foods and higher calorie foods. Um, and the likelihood of them doing that maybe is less than if they had access to all the macronutrients and all the refined sugar that they wanted and whatnot. But I find that funny. I want to differentiate that because we're not necessarily talking about how low carb is best for weight loss because you're going to be burning fat. Like that's not a thing. It's more about the total energy consumption at the end of the day. But you just brought up a really important point that I was thinking about, where it's like people who go low carb, people who go keto, they end up feeling better because they're eating less shit, right? You take that Starbucks example. It's like, nah, the breakfast sandwich or the scone or even the coffee, like those things are kind of off limits. And so you can see, it's process by elimination. When you only have a finite amount of things you can select from and pick throughout the course of the day, you're going to likely reduce the amount of calories you're consuming. Like that's just something that happens for a lot of people. But again, in addition to that, usually people are eating higher protein. Usually they're having maybe more fiber dense foods that we're talking about, or more vegetables, or more lower calorie, higher fiber, higher bang for your buck type of foods that are going to keep you fuller for longer. So it's not just the process of you eliminating carbohydrate and eating a very low carb diet that is preventing your blood sugars from rising, which prevents your insulin from spiking, which causes these blood sugar imbalances that is driving people to eat. It's more about the fact that no, like your diet quality looks a lot better than maybe what it did before that in comparison. So I say all this because I want to speak to kind of the ketosis, keeping this related to appetite regulation. But people who are going truly into keto, maybe if you can, maybe just describe what ketosis is or how that might work. But do ketones have a unique impact on our appetite regulation? Is that one of the benefits that we might see from people going to the extreme and going that low carb into that dieting protocol? And, is it fair to say that maybe we might see similar differences or benefits in low carb diets outside of the factors that we just talked about? But if we had to talk about ketones and what that is and how that's relevant to appetite regulation when people choose this dietary approach, like how do we go about helping people conceptualize like how that might be working in their favor, how that might be different than them having a more balanced diet with all the macronutrients?
Yeah. So I guess if we start kind of from the very beginning, ketones are produced effectively when we have so much lipid in our bloodstream that we cannot utilize it all. Effectively, ketones are produced inside of the liver when we have a specific metabolite of lipid burning or lipid metabolism that is kind of accumulating inside the liver. So we think effectively there's so much fat being shuttled to the liver that it can't effectively store or package or utilize all that fat. So it begins to accumulate, we can think. Byproducts of that fat accumulate. And then the liver begins to produce ketones, sends those out to the rest of the body, and the rest of the body can utilize those ketones. Um, so effectively, ketones are the result of metabolizing more fat than the liver can handle. Fat, when people think of, hey, I'm burning or metabolizing fat, they think, hey, that means I'm losing weight. Um, Very importantly, if I'm eating 100 grams of fat, that 100 grams of fat that I just ate is going to be burned before any body fat is going to be burned, or before the net balance between fat ingested and fat on my body is going to equal out to fat loss. Um, so the idea of burning fat isn't necessarily anything unless you're in a caloric deficit, the same way that you would be burning fat if you were in a caloric deficit eating strictly protein and carbohydrates. Um, so again, we can kind of just dismiss the idea that ketosis itself is magical because you're burning more fat, meaning you're losing more body fat. You're burning more fat, but you're not burning more body fat in a sense. That being said, oh, excuse me. um, One thing that we do know about ketones is they do have an appetite suppressive effect. So ketones bind to effectively a multitude of different receptors, one that increase GLP-1 and two that decrease appetite directly in the brain. So we know that ketosis itself is a state of reduced appetite, or the ketones themselves mitigate appetite when they are above our. So you think, importantly, we're producing ketones throughout the entire day, but typical ketone levels are very, very low. And as we see ketone levels rise, we might see a greater and greater appetite suppressive effect. So yes, it does appear that ketosis itself can reduce appetite because of those ketones being present. And that's why a lot of times we see, so it's kind of important when we think about this. At the very beginning stages of ketosis, the body isn't necessarily adapted to utilizing ketones very well. So people will see high levels of ketones in their blood, but they'll actually be urinating out a lot of those ketones. Effectively, those ketones aren't functioning properly because the body isn't adapted yet to use them or utilize them for their best purpose. So at the very beginning stages of ketosis, a lot of people see very high ketones and still are very, very hungry. Effectively, because our brain or our body isn't able to fully reap the benefits of the appetite suppressive effect of ketones. And as people get more and more adept at ketosis, they begin to see a better appetite suppressive effect because, again, their body's becoming better and has more machinery to utilize those ketones effectively. So that's why a lot of people say it can't be ketones suppressing my appetite because I tried ketosis. I measured, I had high blood and urine ketones, but I was still super hungry because effectively we're just pissing out energy, which at the very beginning stages of ketosis technically has a very, very minor weight loss benefit. But as we get adapt to ketosis, if we're planning to do it for a long-term thing, we don't see any long-term benefit of urinating out more energy, if that makes sense. That being said, low carbohydrate diets um, can have a very appetite suppressive effect simply because we are removing the carbohydrates, but we're probably adding in things that are also appetite suppressive. So protein, fibrous carbohydrates, some of those micronutrients, and some dietary fats. Specifically, we see kind of like in order. We see the unsaturated fats are more appetite suppressive than the saturated fats. And the longer chain those fats are, the more appetite suppressive they are. That being said, it's very difficult to micromanage the exact chain length of fats that you're consuming, but it's just data that we have out there. So things that are very long chain and unsaturated tend to have the greatest appetite suppressive effect. A lot of those things are found in like nuts. Um, that being said, low carbohydrate diets can have utility, especially for those people who, um, when they think of carbohydrates, they don't think of fruits and vegetables. They think of cookies and cakes and pastries. So pretty much our idea around what a carbohydrate is and where they're coming from, excuse me, that's important for kind of what we're actually removing when we're going low carbohydrate. Um, that being said, we can see that high carbohydrate diets and low fat diets can be just as much utility, especially for appetite suppression and weight loss. Again, given those carbohydrates are coming from um, satiating sources, so fibrous carbohydrates specifically, and then those complex carbohydrates, things like potatoes, roots, tubers, oats, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Again, as always, I'm just thinking out loud here, but I'm like, you bring up a good point, like checking blood ketones or urine ketones. And when people, again, who are sitting here saying that I'm going keto, like usually people don't go to the extent, and I'm making generalizations here. Some people absolutely do. And that can be an experience that some people have that might be positive, a lot of negative experiences coming from like micromanaging and being really obsessed with how many carbs you're getting and if you're in ketosis and how long you're in it and what your ketone levels are. Most people aren't out here checking their blood ketones after meals or checking their urine every single day, and that's not an endorsement or advertisement to start doing that, right? And I say that because a lot of people, when they say they're keto, I find that they just had some variation of a low carb diet. And I think once we can kind of clarify the difference between the two, because again, someone not being in ketosis and not being full on keto, it's still a different conversation than somebody who's been keto for 6 months or a year or more, or have cycled in and out of, ketosis. From an appetite regulation standpoint, a dietary approach standpoint, and what we do indefinitely after that, like it's just a different starting point than someone being like, oh yeah, I went keto for 4 weeks for my beach vacation and then just went crazy, when got to Mexico or whatever, wherever people go these days. I'm happy we differentiated those two because, you might not get the same appetite suppressing benefits as someone strictly on keto, micromanaging everything that they're eating and checking for that, versus somebody who's casually going into this mindset of like, I'm not eating refined sugar, I'm not eating any grains, I'm not eating any bread, I'm not eating anything that, comes from a bakery or that has the color white in it or whatever food rules that we impose on that. But again, there's still some benefits of doing that from the standpoint of you are reducing the amount of empty calories you might be getting. And oftentimes, if you're doing it correctly, maybe replacing that or increasing the consumption of some of these other more satiating, more bang for your buck foods, which is again where I think low carb diets can be great, and I think they have a time and a place. And some people really prefer that style of eating. I find that a lot of people going in with the mindset of I'm going to be low carb forever usually isn't very practical, and like trying to figure out a way to incorporate or include carbohydrates at some capacity and like having a decent relationship with that macronutrient group is probably better for people over the long term, just knowing life changes and their responsibilities and how important food is in people's lives or the rest of their life. Like you having the mindset I'm not going to have carbs or reduce carbs for the rest of my life, if you don't have to, like it just probably isn't the best way to think about food over the long term. But when we talk about fat loss and we talk about body recomposition and changing your physique, like low carb diets can and do have utility for that, in the form of energy restriction. So I'm happy we're acknowledging that. And that's why like you and I having these conversations, it's very different than a low carb advocate who's created their whole identity and personality and who's written a book about that. I think people's ability to appreciate, hey, fasting has benefits, keto has benefits, flexible dieting has benefits, tracking food has benefits, different types of exercise modalities, they all have benefits. Like not tying yourself or marrying yourself to one dietary protocol is probably a good headspace to be in for a lot of people instead of live or dying by whatever diet they follow. But low carb dieters tend to have positive experiences in certain situations because one, they get results, right? Because when you cut out a whole macronutrient group or really limit that, you can really reduce your energy intake and you can see progress quicker a little bit. People also associate that unknowingly with just water fluctuations too at the end of the day, which I think kind of puts an asterisk next to people's weight loss stuff where it's like you have someone who goes low carb for a week versus someone who just manages their calories and has a plethora of carbs throughout the week. Like the person who goes keto or low carb is going to lose more weight in that first week or maybe month compared to the person who is doing a little bit more of a modest deficit with all macronutrients involved. But if you look at the month, 2, 3 month mark, like those people are going to lose the same amount of weight, assuming their carbs, or sorry, assuming their calories and their protein are equated at the end of the day. But again, it's the other benefits that people get from these low carb diets that you hit so well that yeah, you're probably having more fiber or more fibrous type of carbs if you're having carbs at all. Maybe having more higher protein. Like if you think about where your calories are coming from and what you build your meals around, it's like, yeah, I'm probably having more protein at meals. And that's probably where we're getting some of these, satiating benefits when we look at the construction of your meals and how hungry or full you feel throughout the course of the day. Um, and then in addition to that, I find that the psychology piece is very fascinating because there's something very interesting that happens when people see tangible results happen from diets that they follow. And we talked about this briefly off air, but I recently did the MNU course this past year, and Martin McDonald, I think he's a really smart dude. I kind of have a brain crush on him with certain things. Um, but we had an aggressive dieting type of lecture and protocol and things that he's very passionate about talking about these days, and things that I've implemented with certain clients. And I've seen very real and very cool results of people eating less or people going low carb or people going on very low diets and seeing their appetite be suppressed more than you anticipate it would, given the calorie range and the starting points that people are starting at. And I suspect that, ketosis might be part of that conversation. But also just the reinforcement of someone seeing tangible results happen, seeing the weight go down, seeing their measurements change, seeing their body composition look different in a mirror. There's something from a psychological standpoint that I don't know if I can explain very well, but I think that also ties into, the likelihood of whether or not people have a good experience or whether they continue this stuff or, whether they can kind of convince themselves that, yeah, maybe I'm not hungry, I'm doing well, and I'm seeing results. And therefore, it reduces the likelihood of somebody rebounding or going in the other direction of somebody who's trying and working their ass off and not seeing any results and then saying fuck it and then going to a different protocol or doing nothing at all. So sorry for the side tangent, but I just find that, low carb diets can and do have benefits, but part of the conversation should always be how do they work and why are they working and how can we make this work long term for you instead of just only thinking about doing low carb diets in these short term stretches with the goal of weight loss in mind. I think that's a very short-sighted way of looking at dieting, given something we're going to do the rest of our lives. But people just, people have a hard time because that's just something we think about over and over again. If, when not done correctly for people.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing I think 9:15. I'm gonna have to cut it.
Do it.
Unfortunately, I
Yep.
apologize. I think one thing is how can we take the things that work in each dietary, protocol, and make them work while eating effectively everything. So, how can we take the parts of low carbohydrate diets? So, take the high fiber, um, take the high polyphenol, typically high protein, and take the, depending on what fat you're eating, higher fat but specific fats. Take those things and put them into a protocol where we're also consuming carbohydrates and getting the benefits specifically for macronutrients, the satiety benefits of specific carbohydrates, and getting the benefits of carbohydrates we don't necessarily get from having a diet omitted of all carbohydrates. So effectively, each dietary protocol has some reason why it works. So understanding why that reason is, most of the time it comes down to the suppression of appetite. So what things are suppressing appetite? What's keeping our appetite at bay and making weight loss feel easy, making it seem like we can eat as much as we want and still lose weight. What are those things, and how can we accumulate them into one specific diet or effectively a way of trying to eat? So for me specifically, and people that I work with, a lot of things we talk about are here are things that we know, especially in your situation, are helpful for suppressing your appetite and reducing your hunger while you're trying to lose weight. One, how can we implement those things into a very consistent routine? So if you're going out to eat, how can you create a meal or order a meal where you're also getting the appetite suppressive effect, but also being able to eat foods that you enjoy and not kind of going to a restaurant and being the person that orders a salad with no dressing and chicken, things like that. So trying to have things that we know suppress appetite and how can we implement those into everyday life. So people who are, they might start on a low carbohydrate diet, and then how can we take that diet and implement in carbohydrates again, while also keeping that appetite at bay. So typically that looks like taking the diet, taking the goods, so the fiber, the micronutrients, the protein, and then trying to add in carbohydrates that also have appetite suppressive effects. Obviously, it becomes more difficult for those who are long term in ketosis because they're going to be getting themselves out of ketosis. They're kind of going to be changing their physiology a little bit, and that might, for a few days, feel a little bit uncomfortable. Um, and just the idea of implementing carbohydrates back in might feel uncomfortable. That being said, I have two clients right now that they just enjoy low carbohydrate diets. They don't want to add in any carbohydrates. It fits their lifestyle, and they have no complaints. They don't want to make any changes. Obviously, we've talked about changes that they could make if they ever feel ready. But because of the way that it fits into their everyday life, they have no reason to make changes because they don't want to. Obviously, we've had discussions around some of the detriments of low carbohydrate diets, but it's just something that for their lifestyle is something that they can consistently stick to, and they feel pretty much like they can eat whatever they want while still maintain their weight loss goals. So obviously, there's utility in these diets, but the idea a lot of times perpetuated by different we call them diet tribes effectively is that our diet is the only thing that works. Anything else is dumb or it doesn't work or it's going to make you sick. So you have to do this or we can't we can't be friends effectively. Um, so I think that idea that only one specific diet is the one that works for everyone is just simply missing a lot. And I think calling it a diet is tough sometimes because most people that I've had people ask me before, like, what's this diet called? It's not called anything. It's just trying to understand the foods that effectively, I say, fit your body well, foods that you can consistently eat, that you enjoy, and that also contribute to helping you lose weight in the long run.
Yep. Spot on, dude. Spot on. We'll end the note or the show on that. I think that was very well said and good way to end the conversation that we had today. A lot of good stuff, dude. We'll maybe book a part 3 in the future. I'll manifest that at some point. We can kind of we can kind of chat about other things related to appetite, but maybe more so environment, psychology related stuff. But I think we hit most of the things that I wanted to talk about from physiologically what's going on underneath the hood. So hopefully people can appreciate that a little bit. I appreciate your time and you know, dropping your knowledge with us. And I enjoy these conversations. I know it's very fun to listen to, hopefully for the audience as well. Again, I'll link all your information in the show notes so people can find you there. But I appreciate your time, dude. And we'll maybe book a third chat here in the next month or two and continue the conversation because it's a fun one.
Yeah, let's do it. Sorry for the crackly voice. I'm getting over sickness a little bit.
You're good, dude. You're good. Go get in that car, bro. I appreciate you, man. We'll talk soon.